Okay, well, thank you for inviting me. It was a very interesting workshop. I was asked to talk about bridging micro and macro approaches when we're trying to understand labor market outcomes. So I took this to mean that, how could research evolve from a good understanding of the micro data sets that we have, labor surveys, enterprise surveys, censuses, even meso-level analysis, to a better understanding of the macro influences on the outcomes. Now, research has been moving in this direction, and I want to stress what are, in my mind, interesting directions and methodologies to answer what, in my mind, is really the main question: why the low return to education in our countries? In addition, of course, to low labor force participation, and these are clearly related phenomena. As you see in this chart, the return to education are among the lowest.
We are not seeing the chart yet, sorry. They are...
Okay, as you will see on the chart, inshallah.
Can you share your screen? See if you can share your screen. Can you share your screen?
Ishac, can you share screen from your end?
I can try.
There is a button.
Yes.
Yes, share screen.
Okay. I share. Do you see it now?
Not yet.
Share.
Yes, it's coming. Yes, it's coming up. You can basically maximize the screen. Just do it.
Show screen.
Show screen. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I can. All right. Here. Oh.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Super. It works. Very good. So as you can now see, and this is from some recent research with co-authors, but others have done that as well. The rate of return to education per year in MENA, 5.5% for men, is about among the lowest in the world. And you could see in many countries, it's where markets are not very developed, the economy is not very dynamic. This is very much the case, extremely low returns. And incidentally, one often thinks of the Arab Spring as caused by inequality. It is possibly caused by too much equality as well, not enough inequality in terms of high return to education. No jobs, low level of good jobs relative to expectations by youth leaving universities. So a good macro analysis would try to explain why this is happening, and that is the crucial bridge between micro and macro. The possibilities already alluded in the first presentation are technological change, labor-saving techniques hurting low and middle-level skills, lack of global integration, which typically could hurt high skills, which would be advantaged by trade, cronism, the political economy of the private sector and governments, autocratic governments not comfortable with an autonomous private sector. And so those combined demand and supply consideration, culture could act on the demand and on the supply side, and is especially important theme to explain the low participation of women to the labor market. Issues about the quality of skills and education, which could be related to the governance of the education system. Old issues of oil and rentierism, which could play through Dutch disease or governance effects. So we have many possible macro stories. The big challenge really is one of bridging the micro and macro. We observe things, we think that there are big causal factors, we don't know which ones are more important. Being able to identify those would make a big difference in terms of policy implications. But really, that requires quite complex techniques in addition to just describing the data, which increasingly are being used by research on the Middle East, but I want to argue more of this is needed. Basically, techniques that can establish causality, more complex identification techniques, such as, at the minimum, Having clear macro hypothesis and looking at different parts of the micro evidence to argue that a particular hypothesis and possibly going further with methods that are stronger in terms of showing causality, such as event studies, using instrumental variables, or even experimental approaches for things like culture, for example. Let me show you an example of each of those approaches. I will mostly use my work because I'm ignorant to some extent of other works, but there are many interesting papers that are popping up in the region that use these pretty more sophisticated techniques. So here are two examples. One about politically connected sectors being associated with less job creation than unconnected sectors. Used to argue, correlation used to argue that cronism is bad for growth. Another example is to observe that educated women are mostly employed in skill-intensive sectors and to ask whether this is due to demand or to supply factors. I'm taking advantage of you to just advertise our book here on that slide. So in terms of pushing a bit further the first question, if you observe this correlation between sectors with politically connected firms and low job creations, you may think that, well, it could be due to the fact that privileged firms go to sectors that are full of rents and not to growth sectors, which explains this correlation. And so, one way to argue against this hypothesis is to check, as we do here, that actually the sectors that are connected in Egypt do very well in other countries and are actually growth sectors. And so that the other hypothesis is not likely to be the case. That still doesn't prove causality. It could, for example, be that we live in a world where connected firms have very good access to the capital market, so end up extremely capital intensive and therefore create less jobs. And those sectors where they're dominant create less jobs. So this doesn't prove causality, but gets us a little bit closer. This paper by Muna Saeed and her partners does a very good job showing us that in Egypt, larger proportion of women works in sophisticated high-tech sectors. And, And the group argues that this is due to a combination of demand and supply factors, and they try but are not successful in really separating those factors. Demand, that is, in those sectors there is less discrimination because women have a higher productivity. Supply, because it's more educated women that go to these sectors, and culturally they are less conservative and more willing to join the labor market. The second method is event studies, and this is tighter in terms of showing causality. Here are a few examples. In Egypt, female labor force participation rose in cities where the protests were more widespread in 2011. This is a pretty convincing paper that shows us that culture affects participation, but culture is malleable and evolves over time. Another example is a paper where we show that the value of connected firms has fallen after the revolution. Third, job creation weakens in the sector after the entry of a connected firm in that sector. Another results due to Riker and others in Tunisia that FDI restrictions rise after the entry of a firm in a sector. And so it's the influence of these connected firms to protect their sector that leads to high FDI and low levels, of FDI and lower growth. A recent example by Malik and Aibel that non-tariff barriers rise in connected sector after a trade agreement in reaction to this trade agreement in order by connected firms to re-establish protection. And finally, another example. Most of those are taken from the book I showed you earlier. That job creation weakens in Lebanon in connected sectors around election times. So it's just around election times that connected firms grow enormously, and that weakens through competition effects growth in other sectors. I'll show you, if I can, a few slides. This is the proof that if you see after 2011, the stock market value of connected firms in blue declined more than non-connected firms in Egypt by about 20%. And that allows us to establish a pity effect, which is the value of connected firms is due in good part, 20%, to their connections. Because it's always possible to think that causality runs the other way around, that is, successful firms become connected because they simply become part of the elite. But this shows that when those connections broke at the time of the revolution, this value came down, and therefore the value, the higher profits that these firms had was not due to efficiency, but rather to their connections. Another example, this is from another paper that shows that after the entry of connected firms in a sector, the missing middle becomes larger in Egypt, and therefore it's not it would be tautological to simply show the correlation between the presence of connected firms in a sector and the missing middle, right? There are many large firms in the sector that would imply that there is less middle, but here it's the entry of large connected firms in the sector that is correlated to a missing middle. This is more closer to a causality claim. All right, let me move very quickly because time is flying to 5 research avenues.
Can I give you another minute?
Another minute. Okay. So I think micro-hypothesis related to chronism, there's still a lot of room for discoveries there. Education and the labor market is another example. One big question remains access to good jobs. Ragi would recognize those slides. Basically, we observe that, as you can see in this slide, if you look at Egypt, the high educated individuals in the 5th column, the inequality among the educated is rising very rapidly. And so we can ask to what extent there is this dualism, this inequality in the labor market, the rationing for jobs, to what extent this is done through networks of influences. I think this is at the heart of the anger expressed during the Arab Spring and worth more investigation. This slide shows you that the very low quality of education in the MENA region on the left-hand side is actually connected to an extremely high inequality in the grades that students receive. So we're not only the region with the lowest quality of education, but we're also the region with the highest inequality in those test scores. And one could use this kind of factoids to ask the reasons why education deteriorated and to what extent it's due to the separation of private and public sectors in education. I don't have time to go into this one. In terms of technical change, I think we need to ask ourselves why the labor share is very low in the region and to what extent this is connected to high capital intensity and low substitution between labor and jobs and capital due to chronism, for example, and the functioning of the capital markets. Finally, I'll stop at that. Women in the labor market. There are big questions about why participation is very low, and it'd be very useful to separate demand and supply factors, like in particular you see in this graph that depicts labor participation in different regions of the world, that the MENA, which is in blue, has the lowest among low education women, less in the middle, and much less of a problem on the high side. So trying to understand this phenomena would be very important. To conclude, because 10 minutes go very fast, I think that thanks to past effort, we know a whole lot in terms of factoids about the micro, whether it's about labor, firms, gender, or education. The new research, the more interesting research, is going beyond these correlations, and we should encourage more work that really focuses on creative identification methods to actually show causality, and that is what will be important from a policy recommendation perspective. Now, this can focus on within countries, and it seems to me the more interesting approach is to look for an exogenous shock and to study evolutions before and after. But it also, some studies are focusing on the Arab region, noting that there are many similarities among those countries and comparing them to other countries around the world. And here, I guess, many studies are actually studying only the Arab countries. I would push to study those as a group compared to the rest of the world on particular dimensions in which they resemble each other, such as issues of culture, issues of politics, or issues of oil, or issues of demographics. I'll stop here. Thank you.